Hello, welcome to a special edition of the Manchester is Red podcast, looking back at United's treble win 25 years ago and reviewing the 99 documentary, the three-part documentary that is out on Amazon Prime today, that myself, Tyrone Marshall, I'm hosting today, and Samuel Luckhurst have both seen. Samuel, first of all, how are you? And secondly, tell us where you were in 1999. I'm sure it's a season that you remember fondly, and I think everyone who listens to this podcast regularly will know that you probably didn't need any of that documentary to trigger the memories from that season, given your encyclopedia memory of times from United and all football, really.
I know it's absolutely flown by. I was actually at home with my mum and my sister when it was the final, and my dad was at the final, and his story from that day is probably worth its own first person piece. I'm not too sure whether it should be told or not, but it was certainly a very eventful day. But he was in Camp Nou that evening, so I wasn't. I think it's kind of like common knowledge what my childhood allegiance was, but the whatever night it was, the Sunday night or the Monday night when he went there, I was pretty distraught. To be honest, I'd passed my 11 plus in January. I thought I was an obedient boy. I was going to grammar school. I thought I'd ticked all the boxes, but I wasn't taken to Barcelona that year. So it was pretty galling. So it was strange, really. Watching it, and I don't really remember too much in terms of watching it. At the end of it, and when they won it, or how what the emotions were or the feelings were at the time, because I school the next morning. I was in year 6, and so you couldn't have too late a night, given the importance of school the next morning and going in. So it was certainly nowhere near as raucous as it was on Las Ramblas that night.
Yeah, absolutely. I was in Shrewsbury watching it at home at the time, and probably didn't know a great deal about United, being a Shrewsbury fan, beyond the fact that people in school either supported them or hated them. That seemed to be pretty much the only two options. But my father-in-law was there, obviously didn't know at the time, and I've heard the story from my wife of him being there and picking her up from school the next day, probably like yourself, with horns blaring and flags waving out the car and all the celebrations that followed. And the documentary is great to kind of relive that. We'll go through it in 3 episodes. We'll kind of go through it in those 3 parts and reflect on what it tells us and that season. And the first part, I suppose I call it a classic scene setter. I mean, it ends with them winning the league, but a lot of it is kind of building up the narrative of that season. And obviously Arsenal had won the double the previous year. A great line from Phil Neville in it where he says everyone has swallowed the Bible of Arsenal. And you kind of get that picture that it wasn't your typical start to a treble winning season, because things weren't all rosy in the garden that summer of 98. There's obviously Beckham at the World Cup, the story in the documentary as well of Ferguson resigning to Martin Edwards and the issues around that, which is told in Matt Dickinson's book as well, which a lot of this film is based on. And it does kind of paint that picture that at the start of that season, you do not see a treble coming at all, really, do you?
I don't think it was even a word that had entered the football lexicon at that point. And they do touch upon that the double was a thing because Tottenham did that in 60-61, Arsenal did that in 70-71. United had done it twice in the 90s as well. But the prospect of winning the English Championship, the FA Cup and the European Cup was nobody had ever raised the prospect of a club ever doing it. And of course, back then, only 2 teams got into the Champions League from England, and United had to go through a 2-legged qualifier against LKS Vodz to get there. The Polish side, they navigated that quite comfortably. And I mean, with the documentary, it's condensed into just under 3 hours, and I'd argue that the treble is a subject that if you're going to do it if you're properly going to do it justice, it almost needs the Last Dance treatment. And the Last Dance was shown over, I mean, it came out during lockdown, which was a godsend for everyone who's remotely interested in Michael Jordan or the Chicago Bulls or basketball in or that period of the 90s. But it was told over about 10 episodes, I think it must have been. It certainly felt like it was near in double figures. And of course, where this is just 3 episodes and they clock in at just under an hour long on each of them, it really is impossible to tell it in an original way. I mean, the director did a Q&A afterwards at the Printworks, which when we were present for the premiere last week, and he talked about the Jeopardy, bringing Jeopardy to it. And I admired him for trying to, create this original narrative, but there are times watching it where you still just naturally feel a sense of tension, but it's mainly watching the footage of it, but you still know what the ending is and what the finale is. And it's a very faithfully told documentary. That there've been certain documentaries that I think mainly confined to Netflix. I've not seen them all, but there was a piece David Walsh wrote in the Sunday Times earlier this season about Drive to Survive, how the editing is inaccurate. It creates drama when there wasn't any drama. It will take audio from one race and overlap it over what's going on in another race that takes place God knows how long later. And that was also the case, unfortunately, for or somewhat ironically, I suppose, in David Beckham's Netflix documentary, where some of the retelling of it was just plain inaccurate. And it was trying to build up tension or try and create some drama approaching a game when there was none, or it distorts the reality of what was going on at the time. And that's not the case with the Treble documentary. And the final episode is probably the best one because it's just all about the final. And I thought watching the first one where they try to, they almost give the illusion that United were struggling in the first half of the season. And I don't think that was the case. They struggled in December, and they did have one or two iffy results. Of course, the Arsenal, they lost twice to Arsenal, both times 3-0. One was in the Charity Shield, which you kind of dismissed. The drubbing they got at Highbury, that was a bad day. But when you look at their results, and I remember it vividly from the time anyway, and earlier in the week against Arsenal, they gone 2-0 up and 3-2 up against Barcelona in an extraordinary 3-3 game. And then the reverse game in the group stage was 3-3. And those games barely get any mention in the documentary. Manchester United come up against Barcelona, 2-3 draws. I think if it was the Last Dance treatment, there'd have probably been an episode dedicated to those games. And they've clearly had a considerable enough budget, but maybe the budget would have stretched to speaking to Xavi, speaking to Luis Enrique, possibly Rivaldo, those other great Barcelona players who were involved in that game. And Rivaldo is my favourite Barcelona player. I never saw him in the flesh, but back then when Sky was starting to show La Liga games, there was an element of glamour and exoticism about Barcelona in particular, where they just won the league, and Rivaldo was the best player in the world. And so when he was turning up on these shores and the games were being shown on ITV as well, there was an absolute wow factor about him. And particularly in the Camp Nou game, he was on a one-man quest to keep Barcelona in the Champions League. And that was another plot strand to the second game, the 3-3 at Camp Nou. Barcelona needed to win to have a chance of qualifying. They didn't. They drew. And of course, the Champions League final was being held at Camp Nou that season. So Barcelona, who, for all the chatter that they could have a home European Cup final, they didn't even get to the knockout stage. But going back to the whole, were United in a difficult state in that first half of the season? They weren't in a bad way. I think they were in the top 3 at Christmas time. And as Ferguson said, and they could afford to back then, United always had kind of rusty starts to the season because that was just the way it was. And then come February time, they'd click into gear and they'd be within reach of the pace setters or the league leaders. You can't do that anymore. And that's been the case for a long time as well, because I'd say Wenger's Arsenal raised the bar, Mourinho's Chelsea raised the bar, Guardiola's City raised the bar again, and you have to be exceptionally good as Arsenal have been just to be in with a shout of winning the title these days. But back then, United, they were extremely entertaining. The Cole York dynamic that really clicked in October time, and you just look at their results in that first half of the season. Although they had an iffy December and they lost I think it was to Middlesbrough just before Christmas, and it was a game Ferguson was absent for because he had a funeral to attend in Scotland, I believe. So it was literally the first United game he ever missed, and it was one of their worst performances and worst defeats of the season. But that Middlesbrough game was the last game they lost. So certainly in December they were in a bit of a pickle, but they had emerged from a Champions League group that included Bayern Munich and Barcelona, and back then only the group winners were guaranteed to qualify for the quarterfinals. It was there were 6 Champions League groups back then. It was the 6 group winners, and it was the 2 best runners up. And United were one of the best runners up because I think in the end they'd have got would have been 10 points, and they scored a hell of a lot of goals in those games. They put 11 past Brøndby across 2 games, 6 against Barcelona, of course, and they scored a few goals against Bayern Munich. So it wasn't the crisis or mini crisis that the documentary makes out. The payoff, of course, from the documentary is that it does give you some insight into this legendary Christmas party that they had that conveniently none of the players can recall in minute detail, other than Gary Neville saying that he remembers Dwight York balancing shots on his head, and the wives of some of the players turning up and unloading on Gary Neville, because Gary Neville being Gary Neville, he had to be involved in the organisation of it. But I think Dwight York says in the documentary that there must have been 250 guests, and he was responsible for 150 of them, which is very on brand for him. And seeing him and interviewing him last week, he was not only dressed for an after party, but I think he was dressed for an after party. And let's face it, he probably organised that after party as well.
Yeah, quite probably. A great line from York talking about that Christmas party and Gary Neville organising it, when he says, Gary Neville was organising it. He's never had a night out in his life. Some great insight. And you're right, a few of the players mentioned the treble. The treble just wasn't a thing then. And I think Celtic, Ajax and PSV were the only teams to have won it before United won it. I mean, Celtic would have made headlines over here, but it was in the 60s. Ajax and PSV isn't really going to make headlines here. The last sort of 15 years, we've seen Barca do it twice, Bayern do it twice, Inter have done it, City have done it. It's easier to do now, but it felt historic the year United did it. And it was, you're right, and then it's hard to fit into 3 episodes because there are so many iconic games and iconic stories from that season, but they've also been retold so many times over the last 25 years that it is hard to get anything new from it. And I mean, the first episode touches on the feuds in a way within that dressing room. I mean, it amazes me how strong-willed that dressing room was, but a lot of them just didn't like each other. I mean, a lot of them was overdoing it, but you've got Schmeichel and Keane kind of disputing the captaincy. You've got Sheringham and Keane having a big bust up at one point. Obviously, Sheringham and Cole's rivalry and arguments are well known. There were some big characters in that dressing room that just didn't get on, but that didn't stop them winning things, did it? I mean, the dynamic between them is fascinating, really.
The mentality of that team, that squad, is unparalleled, I think, in United's history. Even the 2007-8 squad that won the Premier League and the Champions League. And let's face it, that was probably, in terms of depth, it was probably a better squad because they had, Ji-sung Park wasn't picked on in the matchday squad. He wasn't even on the bench in the Champions League final when he played in both legs of the quarterfinals and both legs of the semi-finals that season. They had an embarrassment of riches. Gerard Piqué, he was very young at the time, but he didn't even get on the bench in Moscow either. The depth was they had far more depth then, but that was a consequence of the schedule changing and games becoming more intense, and squads have expanded a hell of a lot since the 90s. But it's just, again, talking to Cole and York last week, Andy Cole, he echoes what a lot of the players say in the documentary, that it's the failures that live with you more. He said he's still haunted by going out to Borussia Dortmund in the semi-finals in 1997, and you look. I certainly felt at the time that was a forgivable failure for United, because it was the first time they'd got to a European Cup semi-final since 1969, it would have been, and they lost a few games in the group stage. They scraped through the group stage. They had an extraordinary night, beating Porto 4-0 in the quarterfinals. But when they came up against Dortmund were a wilier side. They were just your archetypal, efficient German team. And of course, they went on and won the Champions League that season, even though they weren't the best team in the competition. Juventus were, but they still beat Juventus in the final. And at that point, United was still, some of the young players it was their first proper foray into a European competition and going deep into a European competition. But Cole is still haunted by it. And of course, he was talking about when Arsenal won the double in 98. I think he says, I'm sitting at home and I'm seeing Tony Adams go forward and I'm thinking, fucking hell, because Tony Adams scored that title clinching goal, if you like, against Everton on Arsenal's coronation day. And I remember Phil Neville at the time saying he was watching it and stewing at home thinking, are they going a bit over the top? And then he remembered how great it is, the feeling to win the title. But that was Arsenal's first title since 1991. So they'd gone 7 years without winning the league. And they still had quite a few players from that squad under George Graham that won it back in 91. And that was what made... There were so many things that made United great in the 90s, but one of them was how they responded to failure. Whenever they lost the league in galling circumstances, whether it was at Anfield in 92 on the day Leeds were crowned champions, or that bleak day at West Ham in 95, or watching Arsenal win it in 98, the following season, they always won the title. It was almost a news story in itself in 2005, when United couldn't mathematically win the title because it was the first time they'd gone 2 years without winning it in the Premier League era. And those were the standards that were set in that dressing room. And it is fascinating that now in this day and age, there's such an emphasis on harmony in sport and everyone liking each other and everyone being comfortable around each other, that you forget that some of the best United teams, there were players who really just could not stand the sight of each other. The thing about Cole and Sheringham is that they really didn't get on. Yet in the 2000-2001 season, Sheringham got the PFA Player of the Year award, and who was his most constant partner? Cole. They performed like house on fire, because by that point York had started to lose focus and he wasn't as switched on as he was when he first came to United. So Ferguson being Ferguson, he could see the wood for the trees and thought, I'm not going to start the season with Dwight York. I'm going to start the season with Cole, who was always starting, but I'm going to put Sheringham in there. And another manager would have thought, Christ, you're not going to put chalk and cheese in starting. It's got to be Cole and Solskjaer, because Solskjaer gets on with him and he deserves his chance all these years into his United career. 4 or 5 years in, maybe he should start the season. But no, it was Sheringham, because Sheringham was doing well. And that was also Sheringham's last season at United. I mean, how can you imagine a United player now winning the PFA Player of the Year award, being their top scorer and still being allowed to leave on a free? It just wouldn't happen now. But back then they could afford to do that because they had Cole, they had Solskjaer, they had York, and here's a guy called Ruud van Nistelrooy who we're signing because we think he's going to raise the bar in terms of our strikers. The mentality of all those players was perfect, and or almost all of the players, I should say, because I think one of the most interesting interviews is Jesper Blomqvist, and it's more on the psychology of it and how he almost felt like he didn't belong at United. And the physio at the time, Dave Fever, tells a story about how Keane pinged the ball at him and he miscontrolled it. And he said, fucking hell, what have we paid £5 million for? And that was the Keane test. He did it to Dwight York. He pelted a ball at him one time on his first training session. He didn't control it. And he said, Cantona used to kill those. And it's cutthroat environment. In this day and age, it probably wouldn't be allowed. It would probably be discouraged by managers because they would worry about it mentally killing a player's confidence. I mean, can you imagine Jadon Sancho training with players with that mentality, with that mindset? It just, he would be eaten up alive within the space of seconds and probably be asking for a transfer as soon as he's just secured his transfer to United. But that's how it was back then. And I know it is 25 years ago and it does feel like a long time. But there are certain standards that you can apply to modern teams now. But that team, the way they were was pretty extraordinary. It did help that there was that homegrown core of the Nevilles, Beckham, Butt, Scholes, Giggs, who effectively came through at the same time and all got on with each other and were very friendly. And then you just had a pretty unique double act up front in York and Cole. Keane was Keane, and it's overlooked. I mean, there are so many subplots that season that are completely overlooked in the documentary, but one of them is that Keane was coming back after doing his cruciate ligament the previous season. And when you look at Keane, his cheekbones when he does his injury against Leeds, and you compare to how he looks when he comes back, where he's got the shaved head and he's very chiseled, you can tell that he has been working like a demon to get back. And that wasn't always his physique. His physique changed drastically in 1998 because he cut out the drinking. He used to be a big drinker. People can read his autobiography, and I'm sure they can remember the legendary stories of his nights out with Ireland and United. I think he actually tells a story in his book in 2002 with Eamon Dunphy that not long after he'd done his knee in at Leeds, he had a call off Stuart Matheson, who was my predecessor as the MEN's chief United writer, asking him about his injury. And he was saying, yeah, it's fine. And at the time, he said he was in a pub with his leg propped up on a bar stool, ordering another round in. But they got to a point where he realised he needed to change his lifestyle if he was going to be a good footballer again, because back then, and somewhat to an extent now, a cruciate ligament injury is the injury that footballers fear the most. And back then it was seen as a career-threatening injury. But he was extraordinary in 98, 99. He was just, you could tell how driven he was to succeed and stewing after the year, effectively a year that he'd had out with the ACL injury. But unsurprisingly, Keane is not one of the contributors to the documentary because, let's face it, he didn't play in the final, and I think the prospect of talking about the treble chapter and verse, it just doesn't appeal to him. He wasn't involved in the Legends game 5 years ago. I think the main reason for that would have been that he'd have had to share the same four walls as Sir Alex Ferguson, given the fallout and the acrimony that has festered between those two over the past. Crikey, it's probably approaching 20 years, in fact, never mind 10 or 15 years. So, but as you said, in terms of the treble, how many documentary? I think when it was announced that they were doing this documentary, I think you and I thought, why do we need another treble documentary? I mean, MUTV did one 5 years ago. We've had the Class of 92 documentary in 2013. There was the Ferguson documentary on Prime in 2021. There's been the Beckham Netflix documentary as well. Matt Dickinson did a really innovative book on it that was released in 2022. It literally is a topic that has been covered chapter and verse. And with the state of the current United and the timing of this documentary coming out and the possibility that the anniversary of the treble could actually coincide with the club communicating a managerial change, there will be some people, mainly opposition fans, who are looking at United and thinking, this is a club that lives off past glories. But I also think that the 20th anniversary it doesn't feel like it was that long ago at all that I was in the press box covering that Legends game, and it got a lot of coverage at the time from ourselves, from other outlets, and there was a game to commemorate it on that occasion. And here we are 5 years down the line, and there's something else. There's another way of commemorating it, and of course it's this documentary that's come out, the editorial involvement of the former players is quite considerable. When the documentary starts, the first words you see are executive producer David Gardner. Now, for people who don't know who David Gardner is, he came through the United youth system, didn't make it, but he was friends and is still very, very good friends with David Beckham, and he's pretty much David Beckham's bagman, but that has considerable perks because he got married to someone from Hollyoaks, and he also shacked up with Liv Tyler. So, as I said, if you can be David Beckham's bagman, you're not doing too badly in life. But the fact that he's the executive producer of this documentary, it gives you an idea of the positive light it portrays some of the players, or most of the players in.
Yeah, that's all for part one. We'll be back after the break to talk a bit more about the treble. Welcome back to the Manchester is Red podcast. We talked before about the sheer number of stories that were kind of around in this season and at various points of this season. I mean, one of them that's touched on in the early stages of the documentary is Peter Schmeichel, I think, deciding in November 98 that he was going to call it a day at the end of the season, and the psychology around the mistakes that had crept into his game. But I thought from the first episode in particular, one of the most revealing aspects and intriguing aspects was that partnership between York and Cole and the way it came to being, and kind of, we talked about the feuds in the first half, but the relationship between those two, as you glimpsed last week when they were still combining off pitch to stick the knife into the current team in a way. The relationship between them is fantastic. You can tell how appreciative York still is of the way Cole went out of his way to welcome him to the club and to Manchester, even though there was a pretty good chance that he was there to take his place. And you see how that partnership clicks. I think Cole says of that Southampton game when it all sort of started for them, it was a partnership from the heavens. And it's just, for all we talk about the feuds in there, the relationship between those two is portrayed really nicely, isn't it?
Yeah, they were. Oh Christ, I think you forget how great they were. Just an extraordinary double act. I think York got 29 goals that season, and Cole got 24 goals, so 53 goals between them, which was an extraordinary number even back then. And I know strike partnerships were rife in the 90s, and they're non-existent now, but they were a unique double act. I mean, again, in terms of overlooking certain things that happened then, and like, was Cole going to be sold? I don't think anybody ever thought he was. United did accept a fee for a striker that summer, but it was Ole Gunnar Solskjaer from Tottenham for $5 million, and there's no mention of it in the documentary. So there's a little bit of editorial mischievousness is probably the wrong word, but they try and adjust the narrative to give the illusion that it was Cole whose place was in jeopardy. York, on his debut, he started with Cole. I think when York was signed, certainly I remember the assumption was that because Cole had played really well in the 97-98 season and was United's top scorer, that it would be a Cole-York partnership. But in that first game at West Ham, it was a 0-0. It's a game that is only remembered for the sheer grief that David Beckham got on his first visit to an away ground that season after the World Cup. And I'm sure people have seen some of the pictures from the time, and there were these printed T-shirts that a lot of West Ham fans were, that said like "You let your country down" and things like that. It was pretty bilious, and people forget that it was Dwight York's debut. It was utterly unmemorable game otherwise. And then I think United's next league game, York scored a couple of goals, and his partner that night was Solskjaer, who also scored a couple of goals. So Solskjaer had his stint in the team with York, and that was going quite well. And I'm pretty sure those two started together in the first Barcelona game. And then it changed a bit because they got thumped 3-0 at thumped 3-0 at Arsenal. I can't quite remember. York might have been the only starting striker in that one. So it was clearly maybe a tactical experiment that backfired from Ferguson. And then I remember Cole coming on when United beat Liverpool 2-0, and he did a brilliant little bit of skill and pulled the ball back, and Paul Scholes scored a great goal to clinch a 2-0 win. But then I think he still had to be a little bit patient, because Sheringham came into the team and did well with York when United went away to Bayern Munich and really should have won. Schmeichel made a really bad error right at the end, and in the end it was a Sheringham own goal, but it was one of those things that he couldn't really do much about it. He was pretty much on the goal line, and he didn't anticipate that Schmeichel was going to clamber for the ball and not take it at all. And then we come to the Southampton game, and they hit it off that day. York and Cole both got goals. United won 3-0. Next game, Wimbledon were thrashed 5-1. Game after that, Bromby were thrashed 6-2 and they never looked back. And there were many other memorable games that season. I certainly remember 4-1 at Everton, a 5-0 against Bromby. But the most memorable, of course, is that telepathy between the two against Barcelona in the Camp Nou. And Barcelona's defence that night was, I mean, from memory, it was pretty atrocious. Just looking at the team now, Michael Reisiger started. I think it was it Samuel Okunuwu, who was a Nigerian defender who played. Albert Salades. I mean, you look at the back four, the back five, and you think there's not much to write home about. And then you look at some of the players in the front six, and it's Xavi, Rivaldo, Luis Figo, Giovanni, Sonny Anderson, and just some really like good to great players who, in the case of Figo and Rivaldo, of course, won the Ballon d'Or. But to still do that to Barcelona in Camp Nou on a night that Barcelona needed to win to stay in the Champions League was exceptional from the pair of them. And it is, I mean, I suppose the daring, and it's very, very fleeting as well, but one of the more daring aspects of the documentary is that they also touch upon York and Cole hitting the headlines on the front pages for the wrong reasons when they, dare I say it, they teamed up in a very different sense, and they do have they do dare to go there, and Cole does dwell upon it rather briefly, but there's a reason. I think if it was the Last Dance filmmakers, I think they'd probably be trying to do an episode around that, but it'd have to have a high rating, maybe an 18 as far as UK audiences are concerned. But I just thought, speaking to the pair of them last week when we chatted to them before the premiere, that synergy, if you can call it, between the two of them, it still exists. Even the way they converse with each other, it is so natural. They're just completely on the same page. I think at the time Cole was saying that, you know, they'd give each other wake up calls as well. So they were chatting in them from morning to evening. Cole, I think he had his lad Devante would have been 3 or 4 at the time, so he was a family man with a son. His other half, York, of course, was very much a man about town, shall we say? But I think York probably enjoyed having that rapport. You've seen it before with, I think in the 60s, you know, George Best was taken in by Paddy Crerand, who was a family man, and Best was obviously a single man. And sometimes those rapports, they become stronger when, although you have very different home lives, there's something that you can take from each other. And look, everyone knows that Ferguson, as a tactician, nobody talks about Sir Alex Ferguson as a great football tactician as much as he'd pour over the details. And in the case of York and Cole, it's almost like, you know, let's see how you get on today. And I think Cole would have been, going into that Southampton game, he would have been particularly motivated because he'd been out of the team for such a long time. And I think they show him at Arsenal in the defeat at Highbury. He's in his suit, so I don't think he was even on the bench that day, because back then you only had 5 substitutes. And of course you've got Sheringham, Solskjaer and York to choose from, and York's the only starting striker. So there are going to be 1 or 2 strikers who miss out.
Yeah, absolutely. When we touched on this before, I mean, you know, Jurgen Klopp coined the phrase mentality monsters about Liverpool recently, but no side has come close to this team for sheer mentality. And it's touched on in every episode quite a few times, really, but especially in that second episode. I mean, it's quite interesting that it's not, you know, this isn't really chronological, is it? Apart from maybe the end. I mean, the first episode ends with them winning the league title, and then the second episode is about the unbeaten run, essentially, from the 21st of December. And a phenomenal unbeaten run. You think of that, the FA Cup run. They played Chelsea, Liverpool, Chelsea, and Arsenal in that run. The Champions League, they play. Well, we talked about the group stage already. They play Juventus and Inter Milan in the knockouts, and Bayern Munich in the final. They had difficult draws in every competition, basically. And the second half of that season, the mentality is incredible. It probably centres around 3 games, I guess, which is the Liverpool FA Cup 4th round game, the Arsenal FA Cup replay, and obviously Juventus. I mean, 3 iconic games, really. If they were in any other season, you'd say they're the best games of the season. They really were phenomenal. And I think it's when we went to the premiere, we were shown 2 clips from the first 2 episodes and then the full episode of episode 3. And the clip from the second episode was around the Arsenal game. And I mean, it is very well put together. Phil Neville, who played in that game, is very good on it and also very dramatic when talking about it. But he really does give a sense of kind of what was at stake that night and how that game has gone down just in folklore, really, as one of the all-time great FA Cup ties.
I think it's probably one of the greatest games in the history of English football, certainly that's been recorded on film. That game did have everything. I mean, Phil Neville is one of the best interviewees in it, and he was a good interview. He's probably the best interview in that Class of '92 documentary that came out in, I think it was late 2013. And he had gone over this. He had covered this ground before of the Arsenal game because it was his foul on Ray Parlour that gave Bergkamp that penalty and that chance to send Arsenal to what would have been the second successive FA Cup final and another meeting with Newcastle that they would almost certainly have won. But also it's the knock-on effect where both teams were going for the title. Psychologically, that was such a huge moment, the penalty that Bergkamp had. And Bergkamp, I remember earlier that season, he had I think it was a penalty, I can't remember if it was missed or saved, but he'd failed to convert a penalty against Newcastle in a league game. So I don't think, certainly when he stepped up that night, I didn't think that he was a sure thing to score. But I also think it was maybe the only time Peter Schmeichel had made a penalty save in normal time or extra time of a game. I think his only other penalty saves were in shootouts. So it's a hell of a penalty save for Schmeichel to notch. His only penalty save within, as I said, excluding the shootouts that he was involved in as a United player. And I think one of the strongest elements of the documentary, of the 3-parter, is that there is some footage that is more, it's unseen or it's rarely seen and it's more intimate. And that pitch side footage of the Arsenal game, it does capture the sheer the ferocity of that match particularly well. And of course, Ferguson, his tinkering at times could drive United fans mad, and it became a lot more flawed towards in the twilight of his career at the club. But back then he did have the Midas touch more often than not, and the team he picked that midweek in the replay, and of course cup semi-final. It's almost like you wonder how clubs coped with a game being arranged 3 days after the previous game being played in terms of ticket allocations and whatnot. And this game was played 3 days after the previous semi-final at Villa Park, and of course he decides to start Sheringham, start Solskjaer, drop York and Cole, and Giggs didn't start as well. Phil Neville would have come in for Dennis Irwin, I think. And in the first game at Villa Park, United had a goal outrageously disallowed for offside. It's one of the worst offside decisions ever given. It's just inexplicable. It's worth seeking out on YouTube because it's such a horrendous decision. It was a horrendous decision back then. It would probably make Twitter crash in this day and age if it happened now and VAR for some reason decided that it stands as an offside. So we possibly shouldn't have had one of the greatest games ever because of that dreadful decision that the officials allowed stand in the previous game. And the momentum swings that night were profound, and as Neville touches upon it, United were brilliant the first hour. They had some really, really good chances after Beckham scored to win relatively comfortably or to see the game out within 90 minutes. But then one swing of the boot from Bergkamp that deflects in off Jaap Stam, and it changed the dynamic of the game completely. Arsenal had a goal disallowed for offside correctly, Nicola Anelka. And of course, they had the penalty right at the death, and they were still, although they had that although that was an absolute killer, Bergkamp missing the penalty for them, they were still the stronger team going into extra time. I think Schmeichel made a pretty good save from Bergkamp and injured himself in the process as well before, of course, Vieira gave away the ball and Giggs latched onto it and scored, for me, the greatest goal in United history when you factor in the greatness of the goal, the significance of it, what it meant, in that game, what it meant in that season. And you could easily do a documentary just on that game. And I mean, the United-Arsenal rivalry was covered really well. I think it was a Channel 5 documentary about 6 years ago on the Ferguson-Wenger years. And of course, that game was the highlight in terms of the spectacles between the teams. But that rivalry is somewhat understandably remembered more for what happened not necessarily off the pitch, because we all know that Kieran and Van Nistelrooy, that took place very much on the Old Trafford pitch, but also in the tunnel the following season with Pizzagate and things like that. So, it's, I suppose, in a filmic sense, Arsenal are, they're the antagonists, and that's how United players saw them as well. But I think when there was that Keane Vieira documentary in 2013, which Keane was a more than willing contributor to, that Gabriel Clark did for ITV, and Gabriel Clark's done some terrific work. He's absolutely brilliant at that. And I think Keane said, "I absolutely despised Arsenal." And we don't really get any of that. Phil Neville is the closest to it, where he's like, he absolutely resented the Arsenal loving that had come about with Wenger's appointment and then winning the double in 97-98. But you don't really feel it too much from the other contributors. I mean, David Beckham is by far and away the biggest name in terms of contributors to this documentary, but he's also probably the weakest contributor as well, because he's, let's face it, he's such a PR massage personality these days.
Yeah, I mean, you can probably argue not enough is made of Arsenal, really, given that, Neville was saying at the weekend, I think, that kind of the thing that everyone forgets is how good that Arsenal team were. That not only did they face those daunting cup draws, but they had to beat an Arsenal team that had just won the double, and at the beginning of probably the greatest rivalry that the Premier League has seen in terms of intensity and maybe how closely matched the teams were. So maybe not enough is made of that. But that's all for part two. We'll be back after the break to talk about a certain game in the new camp. Welcome back to the Manchester is Red podcast. The final episode of the 99 documentary centres basically around one game and the quest for the treble and the final game. And it kind of picks up where the last one leaves off at the end of the cup final. United had just won the cup final. Even though it's kind of condensed into this 3, 4, 5 day period, including the celebrations, it's still probably, well, for me, it is the strongest episode. And I think you've already said that as well. And I agree that this is all a look back to 99. It's all about nostalgia, but the footage in the lead up to this game, and especially the kind of the days before it, is so nostalgic. It's not about the match footage. It's the footage at the team hotel. It's the footage in London when they're getting back from the cup final, and Victoria Beckham walking into the hotel there. And there's so much of that footage. The footage of Ferguson going into the pilots section, what do you call it, on Concorde, and then getting on the Concorde, and then even the fan footage in Barcelona. And so much of that is just totally of its era. And although all the football is obviously nostalgic, I thought that kind of build up to it was really well put together, and it really did take you back to a moment in time.
That was probably the most impressive aspect of it. That there was footage that I'd never seen before. The footage from around the team hotel in London after they'd won the FA Cup against Newcastle, and I think it's from the morning after, isn't it? You've got them all checking out, and they flew straight on to Barcelona, and then there's more intimate footage of them just sat at the carousel at Barcelona airport waiting for their luggage, and there are plenty of fans present already. I'd seen some pictures from that time. There's a great picture, I think, of them all sat around the carousel, and Keane is right at the end. And although they're all together, he's just enough detached that he looks detached enough from the whole group and the expression on his face is that I really don't want to be here.
Yeah.
Like it is well and truly dawned on him that he is not going to play any part in a European Cup final, and that ate away at him for the rest of his career. He never got to. He scored in a semi-final against Bayer Leverkusen in 2002, but United went out on the away goals rule. He's never ever going to get over that, I don't think. So that's why he's not a contributor to this documentary. That talking about a Champions League final that he wasn't part of. That's about as appealing to him as, I don't know, joining in with Rangers fans about an anti-Celtic song, I suppose, given his allegiances north of the border. And as you said, like there's some great fan footage as well, because obviously back then you had to, if you wanted to record something on your holiday, you had to buy a camcorder, and it had to go in a separate bag, and it wasn't particularly compatible. And then you'd have to get the right tape and do the right editing and what have you. And these days you just get something out of your pocket and you can record something in an instant, and it's stored on that device. But as you said, there's a hell of a lot of nostalgia around it. I mean, I was sat next to Steven during the premiere night to nudge him, but I think he missed it, and it is a real blink and you'll miss it. But my dad does actually crop up in the documentary when I think the squad are on the way to the stadium, and they show them in the bus, and then they cut to a fan holding a St George's flag with the United crest on it. And an inflatable European Cup in a bit of, I think it's an Umbro. It's a vintage shirt, but it's an Umbro version that had been manufactured quite recently. So my dad does cameo in it, but he cameoed in. I think they released a video on the treble, a special European Cup final one in 1999. He cropped up in that. He cropped up in the MUTV documentary a few years ago. So he's nearly having as many cameos as Sir Alfred Hitchcock in his own films, I think, at this rate. And then when it comes to the game, I think it's everyone knows how it played out, and it is. I think the more interesting contributions there are actually there were two voiceovers from journalists, Matt Dickinson, who, as I said, did the book on the treble a couple of years ago, and Oliver Holt, who was also present in Camp Nou, and they're going over how essentially they're writing pieces that Ferguson had got it wrong, that he'd overthought it. And of course there's a big focus on Beckham moving into central midfield, Giggs moving to the right, and Blancvis on the left, because logically, although they were without Keane and Scholes, and also a lot of people forget that Henning Berg was injured as well, which would have, I think if Berg was fit, then it would have been a straight case of Henning Berg with Jaap Stam in defence and Ronnie Johnson going into midfield. But with Berg not available, I think Ferguson did overthink it, because he did have the option of playing David May, who had barely played that season until the end of the season. He started in the final league game against Tottenham because I think Stam was carrying an injury. And then he started the FA Cup final as well, because they didn't want to risk Stam. So Stam was held back for the Champions League final. And come that final day, May, he says, and he was rooming with Teddy Sheringham. They're going through all the permutations as to who the team could be, and both of them kind of selfishly had themselves in every team. And then come the final day, Sheringham was never going to start, even though he had a great game in the FA Cup final. But I think May was entitled to think that he had an outside chance of, or better than outside chance of starting, just because of the logic that Ronnie Johnson was such a good central midfielder. He got in there, and he was also offered that security. And I know Nicky Butt was more of a deep line midfielder, but he did have it in him to bomb forward if need be. But they needed some steel in there. And Beckham liked to think of himself as a central midfielder. And he says in the documentary that he took it as a compliment that the manager trusted him to play there. But as they show in that archive footage of Terry Venables, who was a pundit in the ITV studio that night with Ruud Gullit and the great Bob Wilson anchoring their coverage, he's saying it's been Beckham on the right, it's been Giggs on the left throughout the whole season. He's not done it tonight. And Gary Neville says that come the final 10 minutes, I remember thinking at the time and having rewatched it as well, then the final 10 minutes, although United had been dreadful all night, they started creating chances for fun because they had Giggs on the left, they had Beckham on the right, and normality was restored. And they had 3 strikers on that point, so the balance was not, it wasn't totally 4-4-2. They were going for it. But Bayern Munich, I think they have the voiceover, the commentary from the Five Live commentary team of Alan Green and Mark Lawrence, and you hear Mark Lawrence say Bayern's legs have gone. And Ottmar Hitzfeld, the Bayern Munich coach, had got it wrong as well. He took Mario Basler, their goal scorer, off when he had been running the show. And he also took Lothar Matthäus off. And Matthäus was aging at that time. He must have been 36, 37. I'd be amazed if he was any younger then. But he had a really good game, and he was anchoring the midfield. He was shielding the back four successfully. But the game did start to turn before. It wasn't like United got a corner out of the blue and they scored a pretty fortuitous goal, because it was a fortuitous goal. There's a sliced clearance by, I think it's Thomas Linker, his name might have been. Giggs mishits his shot that's going well wide, and Sheringham doesn't make totally clean contact, but it's, in a way, it actually ensures the ball is as far away as possible from Oliver Kahn. But in the lead up to that, they were getting chances. Oliver Solskjaer, with his first touch, had a chance. I forgot how good that chance that falls to York, where he has an air shot, when really, given his form that season, he should have scored. Sheringham had a decent opportunity as well. That they were, at that point, they were starting to dominate the game, and Bayern had started to tire. And I think Bayern were without, I know it's just one player, but they didn't, two players. They didn't have Giovanni Elber in their team that night, who'd been an absolute pest for United in the Champions League game at Bayern Munich Stadium, the old Olympic Stadium in Munich. He scored that night. It was an offside. He was well offside. It was a dreadful decision, but he did score, and he was a very good strike for them. And also they had Vicente Lizarazu missing, who was the left back, who'd also just the previous year he'd won the World Cup with France. At that time, he was possibly the best left back in the world. I always thought he was a more complete left back than Roberto Carlos, not as revered as Roberto Carlos, but possibly a better all-round left back, in that he was good going forward, but he was also a better defender. And you do wonder that if Bayern had those two players in their team, and obviously United didn't have Keane or Scholes in their team, but that clearly, I think, contributed to Bayern's lack of freshness, because Elber was a very athletic striker and Lizarazu had a terrific stamina at left back. But United, although of course there was an element of luck with the first goal, they were building momentum, and you think if Ferguson had changed it a lot quicker, as he should have done, and let's face it, the first half was such a write-off, he should have made a change at half time. If he had made that change sooner and United had got into their rhythm quicker, maybe it wouldn't have been a dramatic Champions League final. Maybe they'd have just turned it around in a relatively dogged way and managed to win 2-1 or 3-1, whatever. Not wishing to put a slight on Bayern Munich, because they had some cracking opportunities to win the game more comfortably. Mehmet Scholl hit the post, Carsten Janker hit the crossbar. I think Stefan Effenberg drew a couple of good saves from Peter Schmeichel. But I certainly think if Ferguson had made that tactical alteration a lot sooner, it probably wouldn't have been one of the most dramatic European Cup finals there have ever been. Yeah, I mean, for narrative purposes, he made those substitutions perfectly, I guess. It summed it up perfectly, but I don't think he was aiming for that. I don't think he wanted it to be quite as nerve-wracking. And it's not a bad film script, that, yeah. No,
it's not. It's not. I mean, I've never watched the full game back, and I would have been, 13, 14, I think, no, 16, 15, I don't know, something like that, when watching it live. And you don't remember the full details of the game, but you remember, I've seen the key bits, the goals so many times, Bayern hitting the post, Bayern hitting the bar. But I couldn't believe the number of chances United suddenly generated in the last 5-10 minutes, like you say, at the end. And it's interesting, a lot is made of this team selection and the dilemma that Ferguson was facing in this third episode. And there's a good bit with Steve McLaren where Ferguson tells him, Jesper's playing. And McLaren's like, Jesper's playing. I'm like, yeah, I've told Jesper he's playing. McLaren kind of senses this is not a good idea because it means where's Beckham going, where's Giz going? And then McLaren sort of saying to him, why don't we do this and this? And Ferguson's just like, Jesper plays because I told him he's playing. And in a way, that's great man management. And we know Ferguson did that so often that he'd tell players, you're not needed for 2 weeks, but that game, you're the man, and that kind of thing. He did that so well. But, he did get his team selection wrong that night. And it focuses a lot on that. And the other thing the final episode focuses on is kind of his, scrolling back through his journey in Europe. And nobody makes any secret about how much this competition meant to him. There's a great contrast, I think it's in the first episode, where he says, I think it's maybe the press conference before the final Premier League game, and he says the trophy they want to win is the Champions League because it would put them on a different pedestal. And these days you kind of hear a different thing, especially from City. We've done so many City press conferences. The one they always talk about is the Premier League and Europe is a bonus. But Sir Alex was just so obsessed about the Champions League and the European Cup and matching Busby, and the players could clearly sense that. And you scroll back, don't you, through these disappointments, getting a hiding from Barcelona, the difficult games against Juventus, Galatasaray, Gothenburg, and it kind of weaves this narrative, doesn't it, of United in Europe and how getting to that final and winning that final wasn't just a one season thing. This was years of kind of hard work and learning their lessons the hard way.
Ferguson's love affair with the European Cup dates back to when he was a boy, when he went to watch Real Madrid beat Eintracht Frankfurt at Hampden Park in, was it the 1960 final? But it was you just look at the result: Real Madrid 7, Eintracht Frankfurt 3. Was it 7-3 or 6-3? And he managed to see the great Real Madrid side that monopolised the European Cup in its early years. And then 20 odd years later, there he is as manager of Aberdeen, toppling Real Madrid in the European Cup Winners' Cup. I mean, if he never managed Manchester United, that in itself is an extraordinarily, just a story that beggars belief. A great personal story of a guy from Govan going to unfashionable Aberdeen, upsetting the Old Firm cartel, and then toppling Real Madrid in European competition. And that was always going to be his driving, eventually at United anyway. In his first 6-7 years at the club, it's all about winning the league, because the European Cup doesn't even come into their minds, because back then to get in the European Cup, the only way you got into the European Cup back then was by winning the league. So the objective for him going to United is we have to win the league, because at that point it had been nearly 20 years since the club had last won the title. Eventually that happens in 93, and then so begins the odyssey into Europe and going to hell and being knocked out by Galatasaray in 93, the group stage debacle in 94-95 when Barcelona absolutely schooled them in Camp Nou. The Barcelona of Stoichkov and Romario, and the Gothenburg of Jesper Blomqvist as well. Knocking another nail into United's coffin that year. As I said about the 96-97 season, that was a learning curve. I think they probably overachieved to get to the semi-finals when they went out to Dortmund. They underachieved the next year in 97-98 when they lost to Monaco, it was a very good Monaco side. I think everybody at that time didn't realise how good that Monaco team was. They had Fabien Barthez in goal. Thierry Henry was in the team. David Trezeguet got the decisive goal across those two games because he got the away goal. I'm trying to think of some of the other names who might have been in that team. I think Willy Sagnol, who was the France right back, he might have been in it as well. they got to the semi-finals, Monaco, but United back then United were always expected to get to the last four of the Champions League. That's the esteem they were held in. So when they went out at the quarterfinals in '98, already people were starting to wonder, even though they'd only been in the Champions League in 2 successive seasons, people were starting to wonder, is this team ever going to crack it in Europe? Those were the standards back then for Manchester United. And Ferguson did fuel that narrative because he didn't conceal how obsessed he was with winning the European Cup and the romance he felt for that competition. And in the end, he did it in a manner which is still being celebrated 25 years on and is a memory. It's etched into the memory of every Manchester United fan who can remember it because it was the most. If we're talking films, it's the most filmic way to win a football match, I suppose, just to do it that dramatically. And it's a plot twist. If you've not got a clue what happens in the '99 Champions League final and you're shown it, it's a plot twist akin to The Usual Suspects.
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be great to show it to someone who doesn't know anything about the story and relive it. But even for those that do, it is a great sort of moment in time, and like we say, and going back in time and well worth a watch and a good trip down memory lane, maybe at a time when United aren't doing so well on the pitch. We'll be back later in the week with a regular podcast looking back at the Newcastle game. We're recording this before the Newcastle game, so we can't spoil it for you, even if we wanted to. And a look ahead to the last day of the season. But for now, looking back on '99, thank you for your time and your memories as always, Samuel.
Thank you. I think this is probably for our listeners, this might be the happiest they've felt after coming away from one of our podcasts. So unfortunately, they'll be brought back to reality, I fear, at some point later this week.
Absolutely, yeah. That's all for now. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you later in the week.